Good evening, everyone. We're so proud of being in this partnership with four nonprofits, one that is devoted to excellence in teaching, another that is devoted to teacher education at the university level, another that is a community organization that works with teaching and working with parents and parent education, and then of course Chicago Shakespeare, and we're a theater devoted to bringing these works of Shakespeare but also other complex texts to life. And so we're these very diverse organizations, but we share this common passion of trying to figure out what is best in the present and future for education, and that's really been the driving force behind these symposia since this is our fourth year. So we want to thank you so much for being here, and it is my pleasure now to introduce to you Dom Belmonte, who is the CEO and president of Golden Apple. Dom.
Thank you. Let's start out with an illusion, shall we? Little darlings, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Seems like years since it's been clear, and so thank you so much for coming out on a brutal evening for this conversation. And as Marilyn intimated, Golden Apple's desire in this is to try to raise the level of quality as well as the content of the School of the Future idea, under the impression that schools as currently constructed don't serve all equally well. And we have an interesting spin on the idea today that I could try to frame this way. You might remember a time when you admired your grandparents and talked about all that they had seen and witnessed. You know, they were there before there was radio, and then there was color television, and look at all that they had gone through. Well, I don't know if you know it by now, but we have supplanted our grandparents in the things that have gone on technologically. Let's just talk about music, since I began with a music image to start out with there. Once upon a time, we held albums in our hand. You remember albums, all of you. And then suddenly we had 8-tracks, which were cool until your favorite song came on in that spot in between when they were changing. There was that break in between. Then we proudly held our boombox, and then we had our Walkman, and then we had our iPod, and then the littler iPod, and soon we will be at a point where we'll be embedding our music in our neck. And we'll be able to walk around and change stations. How does this connect, this technological marvel that's around us, with the education facility that seems to be mired in a different, darker age? So too, the spaces wherein education occurs is still in a flux. When I was in grammar school, like perhaps some of you here, I'm a beneficiary of Catholic education, and so I have many years when in front of me, Sister Mary Holy Water stood in front of the 45 or 50 students in her class and was able to completely control the classroom by dint of her barely concealed ferocity, and the fact that you could never quite see where her limbs were. But today, the space by which education occurs is also in flux and in need of change. And we have people so much smarter than me to be able to lead us in this conversation this evening, to which, again, I thank you for your attendance and introduce to you our moderator for this evening, Alison Cuddy.
Thanks, Dom. Thanks, Marilyn. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Hi. In this, our 14th month of winter, it's kind of you to come out and join us. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank, as always, the Chicago Shakespeare Theater for providing us with this opportunity and this beautiful space, now decorated for Gypsy, to have this conversation. And of course, the Golden Apple Foundation, National Louis University, and the Family Action Network, or FAN, our partner in this evening's conversation. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming. A couple of notes about how we're going to proceed this evening. If you haven't been here before, we'll have about an hour of conversation with our guests, and then we'll have a question and answer period, and we invite you to participate. We'll have a couple of people in the audience with handheld mics like this one. Please participate by actually asking a question. So gather your thoughts and have that ready to go so we can get to as many people as possible. But we also have other ways for you to participate this evening. You may have heard of this thing called Twitter. We are using that medium. We are actually streaming right now. We're on Ustream television, so wave to the invisible cameras. We're on Facebook, but we're on Twitter. And we have a hashtag for this evening's event. And the hashtag is CIE, so Creativity and Innovation in Education, CIE14. So please turn off the things that make your phone make noise, the rings, the buzzes, the flash, but use your phones to have a conversation with one another. And actually, at our last event, CIE 14 became a trending topic in Chicago, so let's do that again tonight. Let's push the conversation out of this space and get a lot of other people involved in it. So as Dom alluded to, we are tackling a thorny and protracted problem, or issue, maybe this evening, and that is the classroom, or that's our starting point. This may be a silly question, but how many people here have actually spent time in a classroom? Is there anyone who hasn't been in a classroom? Phew. It's hard to imagine we could arrive at this point without being in one. And in fact, I was thinking that in many ways, this space is a lot like a classroom, you know? I mean, we're all sort of seated in rows, facing forward. The educators or people who are going to lead the conversation are at the front of the room. Of course, this is also a space for many other things, for entertainment, for enlightenment, but it is a space of education. Radio, too, the medium I work in, is a medium of education. It's a classroom of sorts, or many people who say that when they listen to NPR find it a classroom, like they're getting an education while listening. It's interesting to think about that there are many spaces that can function as classrooms, and yet the classroom in school proper hasn't changed all that much. There are still very standard elements of it, listening, like radio, sitting in rows, paying attention to someone at the front of the class. Tonight, we're going to have two people join us who have thought a lot about redesigning, rethinking, and radically altering that space, and I want to welcome them to the stage now. The first is a woman that I've known for some time. In 2008, Chicago Matters, a series that was a partnership between Chicago Public Radio and WTTW and the Chicago Public Library and the Chicago Reporter. We did a series on celebrating the centennial of Daniel Burnham and his plan for Chicago. And as part of that, we profiled 10 visionaries. And at the top of that list of visionaries was Nichole Pinkard. She is an associate professor in the College of Computing and Digital Media at DePaul University in Chicago. She's the founder of Digital Youth Network and co-creator of the online learning platform Remix Learning. And she's a co-founder of UMedia, which is a public learning space that immerses high school students in a context of traditional media like books, but where they make and produce new media artifacts such as music, games, videos, and virtual worlds. So please, a warm welcome to Nichole Pinkard.
Thank you.
Our second guest is a man who's been long interested in the intersection of design and learning. Trung Lee, he goes by Lee, is a principal at Canon Design and an award-winning designer of learning spaces in the United States. His collaboration with the designer Bruce Mao resulted in the publication The Third Teacher, 79 Ways You Can Use Design to Transform Teaching and Learning, an incomplete manifesto, quote unquote, on how design can transform the ecology of learning. And launching from the collaboration with Bruce Mao, Lee founded the Third Teacher Plus, which is an education design consultancy. So please join me in welcoming Trung Lee to the stage. Hello.
Hello.
So I thought, even though the classroom doesn't fully sum up what it is you do in terms of learning and learning environments, I thought I would start there and by asking, why are you both interested in the space of the classroom and rethinking that space, you know, as opposed to, say, curricula or the teacher-student relationship or something else? Lee, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I guess there's somewhat of a correction to that, is that we don't start the conversation by thinking about space, which for me is very object-oriented, and everything that's inside that space are very object-oriented, chairs, you know, smart wall, whatever it is. We actually start our conversation about the idea of learning, right? And I think it's interesting point in time in which, you know, I think that most of us here has some connection to the idea of teaching and learning. But it's really a shift to say that can we put aside in terms of how we teach and focus on how we actually learn. And I think from that would be the launch point into we start to envision what would the spatial implication of that look like. I would never, and in fact, most of our clients get extremely frustrated because we don't start from the perspective of space.
Okay. You start from the perspective of learning, and then the design of the space flows out from there.
Yeah. And I think that this will be an interesting conversation because it has an interest in physical space, and we also have an interest in the digital space and how they overlap. But I think that at the core of learning is human interaction, right? It's the idea that we have this capacity to interact with each other, and through that process, learning occurs. So I never forget about the core, the foundation in which that there is an interaction that's taken place between, you know, us as human beings.
Yeah, that's clearly an important element of the work that you do, Nichole Pinkard, and I'm thinking about, in particular, a space that I've been inside, the UMedia space, where there are all kinds of interactions going on between people, but at different levels as well. So can you talk about why space has become, the learning environment has become important for you?
So for me, I think the fascination with space and trying to understand what it means for classrooms actually comes from years of understanding the space of sports, basketball courts, and music rooms, or, you know, places, softball diamonds, and how much those spaces where you're able to play, you're able to practice, you're able to spectate, you're able to see what's possible, and you're able to oftentimes get coached and mentored to know what to do next. And seeing how much, you know, I grew up and my mom's here, and everything for me was about basketball and where I can play basketball and all the rules and understanding everything. And then you go into a classroom where oftentimes you don't know the rules. You don't know necessarily, or you know the rules, but you don't necessarily know how to, you know, it's hard to look at someone else and say, well, what do I do to get better? And so I've always been fascinated to say, we know that kids and people perform in these other spaces, so what is it that we can take from that and bring into the classroom space? And so the library, the opportunity to work with the library in the creation of UMedia was that in-between of how could you actually take a place that's full of books, that has its own set of rules and own set of culture, but could you create another type of space where kids are driving to be there, wanting to learn more, helping each other, they're being coached, they're being mentored, but they can physically, and they're performing. I think it revolves around performing, getting feedback on your performance, and knowing how to get better. And I think all of that does take place in some of the best classrooms in the world and here in Chicago, but I think there's ways that we can make it more available in more classrooms.
Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about where to start, because as you've talked about, Lee, the classroom even though there are better and worse classrooms, is a startlingly homogenous space, across countries. And, many of us, that's an experience we share. We've been through that traditional classroom. We survived it. We learned something. What's wrong with the space, and where do we take it?
That's interesting. So I guess what I think for the most part we're here tonight to somewhat radically, optimistically challenge the status quo to a certain extent, and I think that for the most part, and certain aspects of it, I'm going to speak from the perspective of a dad that has 4 kids in the a really good public school systems. But along with that, there's frustration to see that there are really simple things that could be improved within that structure and context that's just not being taken advantage of. So I think that the introduction talks about the mentioning of the word classroom, right? And I think that just by mentioning that word, there is an expected behavior from hearing that word from the perspective of the learner as well as perspective of the teacher. Mm-hmm. And I think for the most part, if you look at the idea of a classroom, it is through the lens, is through designing through the lens of teaching, not so much through learning. That's where it's really kind of optimized, right? So we want to challenge that idea that if scientifically, the way that we understand how the brain and minds and social and the psychological aspects of how we all learn, what are we willing to do about it? And how can we create an environment that's emblematic to the way that we learn? So I think for the most part, that really needs to be challenged all the way down to the language in which we use to describe space. So when we call something a classroom, there is an implied expectation in terms of what should happen inside, unlike what you describe in terms of a basketball court. I think it's kind of a cool metaphor. And you mentioned this place. I like to say that could a learning space be more like a black box, where a group of people, teachers, learners, and ultimately we're all learners, has the ability to reconfigure that space in time. Mm-hmm. Depends on what that subject and what that group setting looks like and what that learning setting should be in order to optimize that human relationship side of things.
So when you say reconfigure, and this is a question for both of you, reconfigure it physically, reconfigure it mentally?
Yeah. I think both, right? I think that I'm not going to shy away from as an architect, truly understand the value of and the beauty of space, but also appreciate the fact that and never forget the fact that the environment psychologically affect who we are and how we interact with each other, right? We feel differently when we're in a very oppressive space, and we feel differently where we're exposed to beauty. We have access to beauty and nature. And I think to one side of that is that, but then there's a science side of that our ability to be able to see at a certain distance give our mind a mental break in order to refocus. And for some reason, not all the time, but sometimes we design spaces for human beings without access to the outside. Daylight is one thing, but the ability to look out is also. So I think that it is a conversation that has a physical impact as well as a psychological impact, and at some point you can differentiate the two, that they're interrelated to each other.
Nichole, maybe you could start by describing the space of U-Media and how that functions as an example of a redesigned or just an example of a learning environment that maybe escapes the traditional classroom.
Okay. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with U-Media, but it's at the Harold Washington Library. It's on the State in Van Buren. So when you walk by it, you'll first see some monitors, which normally when they're on are showcasing the work that students have done inside, which hopefully is a draw into the library. But when we sat down to create it, one is we had a very limited time. I think there was 6 months between conception to when the library actually opened, and a lot of different players involved. And we were trying to work with this concept called Hamago, hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, which is from a book of Mimi Ito's out of University of Irvine, and work that was supported by the MacArthur Foundation. And the notion was, and again, you'll hear me say sports multiple times, but the notion is that oftentimes you want to hang out. You just want to be someplace with friends. And sometimes if you're there with friends, or just being not necessarily someplace where you have to have a mission, then you might be open to possibilities. Messing around is trying to give you opportunities to try something out without a lot of commitment, not with formal instruction, so you can sort of see what happens. And then geeking out is the opportunity to say, I want to go deep in this. It's connected to my identity. I want to get better. And so the hope is if you create spaces where someone who might just be coming in, so let's say you have Jones, they're out of school, they're just coming in, it's right down the street, they're there to hang out with their friends, but they look over and they see someone playing the piano, and they can see it, and and they're like, oh, well, maybe I want to dabble in that, and that they can have low-hanging fruit, but at the same time, you have what we call hooks and triggers. So if they have a little experience in that, we might say, hey, we have a workshop that starts at 3 o'clock. Why don't you come and join this? I think when we talk about UMedia, oftentimes we focus on what takes place in UMedia, but the reality is where we're hoping to, we'll see more of the work go now, is that really for the geeking out, there's only so much. We all know if you want to geek out, you have to spend hours upon hours and upon hours. And there's only so much that you can do in one place. So how does UMedia become a connector and a bridge to all kinds of learning experiences around the city? That now, because a kid has tried it a little bit, they're now willing to get on that bus and to go further and to go to that program at that other location, because now they know they have an interest in it. And so what we've seen in some of the data, what it's told us with UMedia, the biggest, the largest body of participants are African American males. And what's really interesting, if you follow their travel pattern to get there, 50% of them don't travel through the city after school to get there. So they're purposely coming from the south and west side to get there. And when you talk to them, it's about a sense of community. And also because there's a recording studio, there's places there where they believe that there's a possibility and access to resources and peers that they don't have in any other space. And so the funniest stories is when you have parents, moms, who will come down and say, I need to see this place because my son is telling me that he's coming to the library every day after school. And I don't believe that that's so. Right? And so it's possible, and I must admit, I was one of the first people when I was told, when we were asked to do this, I was like, you want us to create a space in the middle of downtown that is going to attract South Side and West Side kids here after school. Okay, let's see that happen. And I can honestly, it's happened. And hopefully we can see, I think there's some learning experiences out of there that have replicability in other places, even with different sets of constraints.
We should say that if those parents come down to check out what their kids are doing, they can check it out, but they can't hang
stay.
out.
They can't stay. So, and that's really important. I mean, that's really a point. They can't stay. It is a space for high school students, 9th to 12th grade. You can't be forced to bring your little brother, your little sister. It's only for high school students. Adults can come in and check out a book, but they have to go right out. And so one of the things the students say is that it's our place. It is our place. We don't have, there's no problems. You don't have, and you'll have a 9th grader working with a 12th grader, one who goes to St. Ignatius working with a kid who goes to Harper. No one knows they're there working on, they have a shared passion and an interest, and they're working together. And then when you think about a space like UMedia and you go, well, why don't we have 50 of these places around this, country? Why aren't we, with the closing of Dominic's, saying, can't we turn Dominic's, these closed places, into UMedia's? There are just few places where kids can go and feel comfortable and make and tinker and try on different identities and feel that it's okay and a safe space for them to be.
The hangout, so this is sort of the starting point, or one point of UMedia, is a really important element of the way you think about the space of the learning environment, Lee. And I was looking at the work you did at the North Shore County Day School, and the way you're sort of thinking about space. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why is hanging out an important element of learning?
Yeah, that's really interesting. If you create a place that gives student agency, that they're empowered to be responsible for that space. And then that's one of the things that we were asked to create for at North Shore the upper school was to create that sense of community. And I think Nichole's kind of hit it on the head, is that, and it was really interesting that we started out thinking about that space mostly for students. But if you go there, you often find that the faculty are literally now part of that community, that there's no longer a separation between us and them. So it's kind of really interesting. But one of the things that I find it so simple about UMedia when you walk into it, and yet it's not being recognized. First of all, it's not a classroom, but it is all about a place about learning. It is a place about social interaction. It's a place about learning from each other. It is what the hot word right now is collaboration. What does that look like? I think UMedia has clearly demonstrate that. But if you can walk in there and see, first of all, some very fundamental thing that we typically don't think about, and I don't know why, you see colors, right? And I ask myself, you walk to any typical school, why is vanilla the most popular colors? I mean, and the simple reason for that, it's convenience for the adults. It's convenient for the maintenance guy to not have to stock, 10 colors versus 1 colors, and it's completely not purposely thought about in terms of how we human beings react to color. Soft furniture, as simple as that, sort of exemplify the idea of hanging out. And yet, we don't pick furniture when we think about school. In fact, we pick furniture because they tend to last for 50 years, right? I mean, imagine some of the furniture that you still have in your classroom. They're selected for one primary reason: they last forever. They do not go away, and they're extremely harmful, I would say, to a growing human body, where we are. Our physical creation is that we are programmed to move, and yet we kind of ask students to sit in these very completely rigid furniture and ask them to be quiet and don't move for 50 minutes. It's completely counter to how we're created as human beings.
So then, I guess, just to push a little bit on UMedia is not a classroom, but it's definitely a place for learning. Can the classroom not be redesigned or rethought so that it can accommodate these kinds of interactions? I mean, is it just a matter of bringing soft furniture in and painting the walls? Is it, making the chairs so they can face one another rather than just be in those rows?
Well, I constantly, there's no clear answer. There's a struggle to that, and there's certain things that are happening in the real world that cause me to always think about the idea of the profession of teaching. So I don't know if you read the most recent article by, what's his name, who wrote, he wrote The World is Flat.
Thomas Friedman.
And he interviewed this executive from Google and mentioned that 14% of the employee at Google do not have a college degree. I think that's the first time I've heard of it. It's sort of a staggering statistics, right? And so there's a very different mindset that these companies are going after. And for the most part, they're not looking for the best resumes or the college certificate somewhere. So when I think about the idea of the classroom, for me, it's so self-contained, it's so isolated, and we live in a world where we're really asking for us to interact as a team. And I always question that. For the most part, when I walk through a school, teachers are really being asked to work as a single professional. There's no sense of team, purely by the way that we had constructed these environments for so long that we have contained teachers to an isolated space. So that's a really interesting question to deconstruct. So for me, it's not about rethinking the classroom, but to somehow rethink the entire construct of what a school is. And if we can answer the bigger questions, maybe we can arrive at a very different spatial relationship that tends to foster me as a teacher, but I have colleagues that I either mentor or learn from, and that the 25 kids that sit in front of me are part of a larger community that I'm responsible for, rather than this is me and my 25 kids. So those are really bigger questions that I always ask that particular community. One other thing that I typically ask is, do you see yourself working by yourself, or do you see yourself part of a team? Because I think answer that questions as a teacher and as a culture of teaching has a profound impact on how we start to look at space.
And I think I just want to say that when we started teaching or working in UMedia, we had actually had our own studio space on the south side of Chicago, DYN, where we had Monday was digital music, Tuesday was digital video, Wednesday was, robotics. So students who came on those days, they all came, you knew what they were there for. So you're there for digital video. Very different teaching in that context. Take the same mentors, 1 month later, and they're now at UMedia, where you have 100 kids there, 20 are there for this program, 20 are there just, do they want to, just hanging out. And to teach in that environment caused a radical redefinition of how we work, because at any point in time, a kid can get up and go. I mean, they're not there that, sign in and sign out. So you have to deal with that. And then you have kids who are there the first 2 sessions and they missed the 3rd session. And so you're constantly repeating. And then we finally arrived at the point where we said, well, let's have these clear milestones along the way, and that we're going to make you responsible for when we get to a certain milestone and we move forward. If you want to join after that, then here's some of the online resources that you can use to get you caught up, and then you can come back. And we're going to put showcases where there's these performances that if you want to show your work has to be eligible, quality enough to make it into there. And all of a sudden, we had students who were saying, oh, wow, okay, I need to show up. I need to be here. I need to participate because I want my work to be seen. I want it to be performed, and I know everything doesn't make it to that. So, I mean, it definitely required some rethinking of the role of first you are the facilitator, you're also the teacher, and how do you work with multiple different students at different ability levels at the same time. So those types of spaces, you can't teach the same way in those spaces. You have to rethink teaching, and you have to put more responsibility on students to own sort of their pathways and their journeys. But you have to provide them the resources to really own it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Does it take more resources to create these kinds of spaces? Do they require more?
Absolutely no. I mean, that's an emphatic. If we look at any of the school that we have been designing in the last, I would say, 200 years, we've allocated a huge percentage of the space that we built towards circulation. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, 25%, 30% easily to my biggest pet peeve is the double loaded corridor, right? It's the corridor that lines up with metal lockers that leads you to self-contained classrooms without any kind of visual transparency or connection to anything else, right? And if you're lucky, you have some windows to the outside from those classrooms. So I think that in the challenging the status quo, it's not about building more and recognizing in the world that we live in where resources are now become something that really needs to be emphasized, that it's not limitless. We live in a very fixed ecology. So it's not about building more, it's about building the right amount of spaces that we need. But ultimately, I think that our ability to make big mistakes, we don't have that luxury anymore. So innovation doesn't have to be brand new as well. I think that UMedia, at the end of the day, was a renovated space at the library. Right?
And to add to that, I think probably the most successful project we had at UMedia was the first one. It was around Hassel-Mankel Street, and we were actually because UMedia wasn't open, we were on the 8th floor, I think, of the library in a big room with no windows. But really what it was a rethinking of the activity structure and how do you bring together the reading of books with the use of videos, the having the librarians work with media artists and kids from 35 different schools working together. Now, of course, when we got into the media space, it was different, and you had different other types of activity structures. But I really think it was the space is important, because I think the space is what draws kids. The kid that you don't know, the kid who already doesn't have an identity around the things that take place in media. I think the space draws them in. But I think really at that point it's the activity structures that you put in place, and the freedom. I will say this, the library offered a freedom to try different things very quickly. So one example, library, when we first started working with them, you couldn't eat food in the library. And we're like, okay, so so students are gonna come after school and they can't eat. And okay, this isn't gonna work. And Mary Dempsey was the commissioner at that time, and we said, okay, it got called out as a problem. And I think within 24 hours, there was a policy change such that kids could allow to have food in media, but it was done from the standpoint of what makes sense for kids, not necessarily what is the policy that normally takes place.
Right, what makes sense for the space as it's been typically defined.
Right.
Yeah. It still requires a setting aside of, it means then reallocating resources in a way, right? I mean, you may not have to build something bigger or something new, but you still have to say, okay, in this part of the library, we will give over to this experiment, or in your case, and I am very curious about, like, say we said, okay, let's make a corridor, not how it functions now, but a space where something could happen, or at least you could channel, because to me, I think of, at least in popular culture, you look at the corridor of a school, and that's where all the, you watch Glee or something like that, all that kind of autonomy and identity and sort of peer-to-peer, maybe not in the best way, but those interactions are happening. So it seems like it's this kind of rich and vibrant space where students are learning, and it could be something that you could engage with. And
yeah, but it's interesting. If you think about, the library before, there's a kids space. There's there really wasn't a young adult space. And it's like, well, what is it about high schoolers or that age where we don't really think that they deserve spaces that are designed just for them? Schools now, most times, the school, if you think about your neighborhood school, kids don't, if you don't go to that school, you don't actually use those resources. And so what are the places? I have a 22-year-old stepson, and when he was in high school, I kept saying, stop coming home directly after school, find some place to be. And he's like, well, where do you want me to be? Right? This is right when media was coming up. You want me to go to Water Tower to hang out? I don't go to the neighborhood school, so I can't go there. You want me to go to McDonald's? Where can I go? And the reality is, where there really weren't, okay, so let's try to get you in this program, but is it a program you really want to do? And so just the creation of, he started coming to media when it opened. So I do think we had to fundamentally ask ourselves, what do they deserve? If we want them to engage in a particular type of activity and be open to trying things, what are the spaces that they deserve that enable them to try and be safe and comfortable to try new things?
I think it's so interesting that what's happening with new media, and I think we can all be proud of the fact that it's one of the major hotspots is in Chicago, but it's forcing, like, you just happen to have a space at the library, but now the entire country is looking at libraries and saying, how do we redefine the purpose of a library? Right? It has that kind of an impact. And we are now having multiple conversations about what does it mean for the concept of a library in the 21st century. And we just talked about how information is drastically changing before our eyes and how we access technology. No, I'm not an advocate for books going away, because I think that there's something wonderful about the tactile of holding a book and reading it. The percentage might change, but every learning institution is now rethinking the idea of the library, because of the idea that new media had caused this wave of how do we use space differently to draw kids into the possibility of learning or being curious about something that they have a passion about.
And one important point is the youth book circulation went up. When all the youth books were put there, first, the youth who are coming there, they're surrounded by books. They probably weren't going upstairs into the library to see the books previously. We then placed books, the music books, near the music place, so you actually sort of reclustered the books together in certain places. So it's like, oh, okay, maybe. And we intentionally did programming that was connected to books. And I think the U Media circulation, at least a year or two ago, was actually the size of circulation of a branch library. And so the youth are reading books and they're checking them out, and you're just providing them more access to where the books are.
The fact that we're having these conversations about, and you know, we understand there's a need to rethink these spaces or redefine what these places are. Is that an opening for you, Lee? How has that worked in terms of the schools where you've been able to go in and do something?
Yeah, so the idea of the Third Teacher Plus group, there was a moment in time where I recognized that I want to tackle learning or education as a design problem, right, rather than a space problem. And there was a point where I recognized that me with a very focused architectural background was no longer adequate to be tackling the bigger questions that much more, which is a very dynamic conversation happening right now. I think it's a wonderful period, wonderful moment in which there's so much conversation about learning, right? And what does learning look like? And so the team, the Third Teacher Plus team, is made up of a variety of expertise, one of which happens to be architecture. So for the most part, when we're engaged with a client, we like the idea that we're invited to the table when they're still struggling with the questions about what does the future of learning looks like, and how does that affect the way that we think about learning here in this very specific place. And in that conversation, we like to say that architecture becomes almost like barn raising. Like, we're coming together, we're going to build something that's new, but how we come together, the meal that we share, the conversation that we share, the stories, the human stories that we share, informs us in terms of who we are, and most importantly, what are really bad habits that we're willing to let go, right? And I think that once you're able to get to that point, you can envision a very different barn, right? So that's kind of how I look at the way that we approach our projects anyway with our clients.
And that also, can I ask a question? That also means you need different people around in the conversation, right? So
Absolutely.
Even the example of the food was raised by a game designer at the library. He's like, what do you mean they can't have food here? I was like, okay, well, the library says no food. But it was someone else from a completely different perspective said that doesn't make sense. And so it was making sure that you have diversity of opinion and experiences, where things that we take for granted in learning, someone else from an outside perspective can say, no, that doesn't make sense in this perspective, and challenges you to justify some ways in which you've done things. You say, oh, well, maybe we do need to rethink it.
So how do you get the community involved? Because you both had talked earlier about the ways in which schools are isolated, and they are separated out from both these other contexts in which young people are learning that's not necessarily deployed in that space, but they're also separate from the community, these other points of view that might see those bad habits, and be able to affect change with a simple observation.
Yeah, so observation is huge. I'm glad you mentioned that word, and the idea of ethnography, understanding culture and behaviors is super important. And so one of the things that we do as kind of a non-negotiable is that we always ask to interact with a group of students. And we do it in a very different way. We ask the students to give us a tour of their existing school. And it's a very different perspective than the admission tour of the school, right?
So what do you hear? What do you?
Yeah, where do we hang out? Like, where is the spot that we go to hide from the adults? And so, because we don't design space for them to go and hang out. We design space that minimize liabilities. We design spaces so kids go home, so they don't hang out. So that perspective from their lens is really critical. And then we tend to get them and put them through a design challenge, because we talk so much about collaborations. Well, what the heck does that mean in terms of observation? So if we can step back as adults and saying that here are a group of students, we just asked them to solve a very challenging problems. We didn't give them an appropriate amount of time, so they literally have to sort of put on their hacking hats in a way. But look how they use the space, the tools, and the interaction through that. So if that's something that's super exciting, and this is what you perceive learning to look like, this is what you perceive collaboration to look like, that becomes your non-negotiable as we think about your classroom, right? And it has a domino effect. That becomes the non-negotiable in terms of how you think about teaching. That's become the non-negotiable in terms of how you think about your curriculum, right? It has kind of that, what we're calling an ecological effect, where everything's are interconnected together, and space happens to be part of that ecology. And for the most part, I don't know why, but we never honored the voice of the students. We never asked them about what they think. What would make them feel comfortable? How would we get them to stay engaged? You talked about the phone in the green room, and I thought that was really fascinating, because that's observation about allowing kids to have access to their iPhone, because that, for the most part, that's their connector to the world that they live in, the environment that they live in. So they go into school and we basically shut them down. We cut off that main artery to their social network, and somehow ask them to stay focused. Right? So.
It's a really important point, I think, about UMedia, but also, I mean, the remix, all of the things that you're doing, Nichole, and I imagine you as well, Lee, but this idea that you don't divorce the new literacy from traditional literacy, that those are still important elements. We've talked about books, but you understand that students have maybe are media savvy in particular ways they're conversant with, and not dependent, but connected to technology in a way that other generations aren't, or connected to a particular technology. How do you see that connection being made in these learning environments, in these spaces?
I think most kids are born. Well, I won't even say that. So I think there's an assumption that kids are born digitally literate, which they aren't. They can pick up a phone and maybe use the phone, but when you ask them to create for purpose, for meaning, that has to be taught. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have in schools right now, when we are thinking about integrating the digital, is, are we actually teaching kids really how to do it and how to be purposeful around how they're using it? So I think that's a challenge we have, and we have to figure out how to create those opportunity spaces and the partnerships with arts and media, where they're all brought together. Our experience has been in schools that we've had the most successful experiences with experienced teachers in schools when they believe that kids have they already have the digital skill set to do what they need to do. So a science teacher is great with integrating video to create scientific heroes if 60% of the kids already know how to do a video. Now, it's problematic if you say do this and you have to teach them how to do it. So one of the things we've worked a lot on is how do you create these spaces where kids can develop the digital literacies, but then make it very visible to teachers what they have. So there's a tipping point. We say, hey, X number of kids in your class can do this. So now this becomes an activity structure that you can embed as a way of representing and sharing knowledge. And so the use of online tools, the use of having online courses where kids can learn for themselves how to learn to make a movie, how to create a game with some online instruction, we found that it's enabled the skill set of students to rise up quickly. And also for them to discover who are the experts in their school, and so who to go ask for. And then it's enabled teachers to be more intentional around the use of digital media in a way that really gets at, do kids understand the content that they're using the digital media to represent, as opposed to, here's just a digital media project that happens to have some content inside of it.
Yeah, can you just say a little bit more about that, what online learning is? Because I think we hear a lot about that.
So
and-
everyone's talking about MOOCs and, everyone's on a
Right.
MOOC. And so in some sense, when we think about the concept of a classroom nowadays, it's like, well, do you mean a virtual classroom? Do you mean a physical classroom? Because, it's all, it's all transforming. And one of the things we had a conversation about earlier is, I think, even as a teacher, I'm a professor at DePaul, and I teach some classes that are hybrid, all face-to-face, some classes that are all online, or some classes that are a combination. And it's very difficult to teach in those hybrid situations, to know, well, how do I interact with my online students who are only online differently? How do I design the activity structure for them that's different from the students who are in face-to-face when this is a lab? How do I get them to communicate together? And so it's a lot of intentionality and a lot of thinking about it, that I just don't think that we provide enough supports and structures for teachers to understand how to do that well. And the assumption is, if you know how to teach in a classroom with 4 walls, that you know how to teach and how to make use of the resources that are in an online platform. And that's not the case. And I think we're going to probably have to take a step back and understand how to help teachers do that more effectively, such that they can, teach. And we see that in the numbers of how many kids are successful when online sites. So I think we're just at the beginning, and at the beginning of any new technology, you take it and you use it in the same way you used another technology. And then now we have to sit back and say, okay, really, what are the affordances of these online systems? And what are they not good for? And just to be more clear and more supportive in teachers and parents in understanding how to integrate them into their teaching and learning experiences.
How does the online space function for you, Lee?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting, right? I think there was finally a recent study, this data that came out on MOOCs, and I think they were analyzing Udacity and Coursera, and there was actually a very low level of students finishing the course. And there's many reasons to that. I think that it's not a sign of failure. In fact, it's just identify that it's really, people are approaching that very differently. There are a group of students that would join Udacity because they wanted the content. They weren't interested in finishing the course. So they look at knowledge, it's like a marketplace. I'm going to go there, I'm going to find what I need, but finishing the course might not be my ultimate ambition. So it's a really interesting thing to say that there is a physical learning environment and there is a digital learning environment. And at this point, I don't think we have a clue in terms of how it needs to be integrated together. But I think that it represents like amazing opportunity, right, for very specific places in the world. And I think that the whole Nichole project, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but
What is it?
well, it was an experiment where a professor in the UK put a computer in the most isolated place in India, places where kids have never seen a computer before. And just over a short amount of time, what he noticed is that they learned to navigate the internet. They actually picked up English, and they were teaching these are kids on the street. They were actually literally doing this on the street, teaching each other how to navigate the internet and how to speak English. I mean, it's just really amazing thing. So technology has the capacity to make learning and knowledge accessible to places like that. It doesn't mean that it means that it works in our context. I'm just saying that there's really interesting things that are happening in how we can leverage technology in that digital learning space. But we're still, I think you're right, we're still trying to figure it out and how to make that experience much more impactful. But I always go back to the idea that there is a teacher-learner relationship. There is a human interaction relationship. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that could ever go away, ever. Mm-hmm. We might supplement that. We might make the resources available, but the interaction of me learning, I mean, I still have vivid memories of experiences, impactful experiences that dates back to when I was around 5. I think all of us have those impactful. And it always involved another person.
Yeah.
And it involved a very strong sense of place that instill a great image of a memory that stays with you. And I think that us as human beings will never give that up. We can never give that up.
You know, it strikes me, I have exactly that relationship to my middle school education. We talked about this a bit earlier. I was part of the open school classroom, right? And we had things like USSR, uninterrupted, sustained silent reading. I don't know if that really flew in the US. I grew up in Canada. But I have very powerful memories.
I like USSR.
We were okay with that acronym.
That's Russia. We're like,
Yeah, maybe. But I remember like just hanging out on the floor with my classmates, and we were in different classrooms, but we would come together for different things, and it might be connected to reading. We were engaging with our teacher, but it was there were very, very strong sense of the peer-to-peer relationship plus the student-teacher. And yet you look at that, which was, started in the 30s, was this incredibly popular in the late 60s and 70s, and is now judged a failure. And I think, to me, it seems similar, maybe not the same thing, to some of the ideas that you talk about in terms of activity structures or even the space of learning, what that should look like and how we need to move away from this. The classroom is one model of a traditional space of learning. So, I mean, what do we learn from that quote unquote failure? I mean, how do we avoid that? Why did that fail, and why is what we're talking about now not just a replaying of that?
So there's theory to how the open classroom got started, and for certain aspects it was practical at some point because there was an energy crisis was happening in the 70s apparently that forced us to design school in somewhat an inhumane way. There were no windows. A lot of schools that were built in the 70s didn't have any windows in it.
Yeah.
So there was a conscious effort of reducing the amount of energy to these buildings. And one of which is to eliminate windows. The other one is just about material resources. But the other story that I've heard is that there was a purposeful revisiting pedagogy, and with that there was an unfolding of a different spatial consequences. The failure that I've heard is that when these open plan schools were built, that the development of a different curriculum pedagogy never evolved. That teachers were literally being asked to teach the way that they've been teaching in a very different space. And that sense of an open concept is not what we're advocating for. Sometimes you need that, but you need quiet space too. Was it Susan Cain who talks about the introverted learner? Apparently 30% of us are quiet learners. And kind of give us a redefinition that the introverts are not the socially inept, like we're not just weirdos, but given the choice of going to a party or having dinner with a few friends, the introvert tends to select the few friends. And so that quiet cave space setting, but more importantly, we're advocating for diversity. There's time where you need a self-contained spaces to give a very informative lecture. But if you're going to do group work, it requires very different spatial experience, and it requires different furniture, and it requires different access to technology if true collaboration is taking place. So I think that from that's what we're advocating for. Not the sameness, but given the same amount of square footage that we have, we should create as much diversity of spaces and intimacy of the human relationship within that context.
Well, let's open the conversation to you all. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone to you. I see some. Oh, let's go here.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Steve Zemmelman on a writing project. The kind of teaching that Dr. Pinkard described is something that's been around for a few decades at least, and there's a teacher sitting right next to me who's been doing it for a long time. I won't say how long. And so my question is, and it hasn't failed, but it also hasn't spread. And so especially when it comes to design, I'm wondering if we could hear about some design concepts for helping those things to spread more, so that we don't just have the concept of the way it ought to be, but how we get there.
So from the standpoint of how can you enable some of the, the master teaching that you're doing spread to other places? I mean, I do think if you create different types of spaces that make it possible, it can facilitate it. And I do think also part of the challenges are oftentimes as master teachers who have a breadth of knowledge and ability to curate, to know where all their students are doing and to be able to curate individual learning experiences for each. And I think that part of what technology can assist us in is doing some of that curation and helping you know where your students are and to be able to make some of those individualized experiences, and also to have some comfort if you're putting them on having them do something online, that if you get the feedback from the system that's letting you know what they're doing, it enables you to be, to sort of pull it all together. I do think one of the challenges, though, when we talk about this type of learning, and I've used to spend a lot of time building systems for early literacy and helping teachers know where all their kids are. It's a lot of data that you're asking a master teacher to take in and understand, like where are all my kids? And how do I group them together? And so I think ways in which we can think about assisting in that, I think is really impactful. We often very seldom talk about the data overload and the ways in which we need to help teachers understand where kids are and then connect them into learning opportunities that can help them. But then you need something back from those learning opportunities so you know how to connect them to the next.
It's kind of interesting that you brought up the idea that these ideas have been around forever. When I first sort of encountered the language of hanging out, messing around, geeking out, I was struck by how similar it is to Montessori. The idea of self-directed, following the child, following your passion, discover things, and then kind of geeked out into something that really draws you to it. So for me, in terms of design and in terms of space, I would really encourage us to sort of rediscover the kindergarten classroom, because that is the ultimate learning studio where multiple subjects are being executed in the same space. We actually don't learn subjects, we learn by doing projects, right? We learn by tackling a project where everything's just kind of messy in that. So the idea of, and this is what I tend to do all the time, is call every learning space as a studio, because this is a place of making. I mean, that's at the core, UMedia is about a place of making, and in the process of making, you learn, and you teach. Also, you teach your peer. The idea of the third teacher came from Reggio, which envisioned that the first teacher are the adults, the second one are the peers, and the third is the physical environment, right? So in a modern version of the Reggio, I think UMedia really fit that. If you can exchange that language, ultimately it's really about how we actually learn as human beings.
Have you seen schools do that, to sort of adopt the kindergarten space as the space for all students? Has that happened anywhere?
We're a big advocate for that,
yeah.
Right? And I think that's why thinking your way out of the self-contained classroom and to create a permanent relationship between a series of spaces allows us to kind of reconstruct the kindergarten studio in a larger scale. And also, if you think about the teaching side of a kindergarten classroom, most of the time actually involve a couple of adults who are in there as a team, right? So these kind of things are really kind of things that we had figured out. And for some reason, as these children get older, we tend to forget, and we place them in a very structure but sometimes impractical setting in terms of how we actually learn.
Well, we say stop hanging out, stop messing around, get to work.
Yeah, gotta make that test score.
Okay,
right?
we have a question here.
So I was going to say first to the teachers in the room, I think teachers often get blamed for a lot of things that are not their fault, and the redesign of the system and what you're talking about, both space and how knowledge is conveyed, would be really helpful. A couple of things I was thinking about to offer up to the room and to our panelists. So I had the opportunity to tour Steelcase's Idea Lab that was designed, as Lee, as you may know, by IDEO and Steelcase. And it was seeing the physical new ways that space and knowledge can be conveyed, and in working, whether it's children or people as old as me, was really fascinating, and it drives that home. And then, Nichole, I was listening to what you were saying pretty intently. So a lot of people have probably read Sal Khan's One World Schoolhouse, and he was talking about the fact that your food example was really interesting, right? The Prussian model of how our education system was constructed 100, 150 years ago. No food in the room. You sit in a chair that would break most people's back and say nothing. But I thought the thing that was the most interesting about him, to connect the two of you, was he talked about the fact that this is a system where everybody's kept in age cohorts, and you're pushed through the pipeline, whether you know the material backwards and forwards and you're really proficient in it, or you have no idea, and such. And I was thinking about space in your U-Media as, teachers do their teaching, and I strongly agree there's no substitute for human interaction. But then how do we use space and design to make sure that every child is proficient, right? In other words, what I think Sal Khan was saying is it's a little bit like what cancer does to the human body.
Is your question, how do we use space and design to ensure proficiency in a student? I just want to give them the opportunity.
So, in other words, what worries me about design to redesign every classroom is I've been up to Steelcase and just how much the stuff cost and how much investment. But if we could create centers where the design and the transmission of knowledge is right, and we fix this proficiency issue, which is oftentimes what happens is the kid starts out and then something...
Sorry, can you hold your... Let's just give them an opportunity to respond to that. Thanks.
So I think the whole proficiency, first is, for me, particularly as you deal with older kids, it's about social capital. And I'm going to learn this because I see a value in utility for what it is that I'm learning. And so you think about, when I use the sports analogy, you're always seeing games played. You're always seeing different people play, and you can find someone who you're like, someone you're better than, someone who's better than you, and you sort of know how to get better at it. And if you think about it, how often do we actually see and I talk about my own teaching, how often are the students in my class actually seeing and playing and then getting enough feedback to help them to go to the next level? And so I think what U-Media has done well is create multiple different opportunities to perform and to play. And the one example I give is when we first started our team for Louder Than a Bomb. We came in last the first year, dead last. It's like, we probably shouldn't do this. But the next year we said, okay, let's think about this. So we did Lyricist Loft, which is a poetry for every Wednesday when kids from around the city come, which means you get to perform. We were working with the One Book, One Chicago, so there was always, for every one book, there was opportunities for kids to write their poems. There were other projects. So by the time Louder Than a Bomb, and there were workshops that happened every week. So by the time Louder Than a Bomb came back around, they had numerous opportunities to perform and to check themselves about what their skill level was. So there was no pretense about how good they were. They knew where they sat, and they knew the work that they needed to do, and then that year they won, right? And it was all about same instructors, oftentimes same kids, but it was just about all these opportunities to try, to fail, to get better, and to realize, hey, that audience there's a big audience out here for Louder Than a Bomb. I can probably, get a little credibility the same way I can get a credibility by being the starter on the basketball team. So I think part of it is understanding We just can't say, learn this. My mother can tell me, just learn it. And when I grew up in Kansas, at that point, everyone was going to learn it, so let's just learn it. But I think you have to think about the role of social capital and how are we making visible the utility of what we're asking them to learn, when many of them are coming from spaces and environments where just saying do this so you can go to college is not, doesn't have credibility or weight.
We have a number of hands up in the room, so.
Okay. I had a comment and a question. The comment, I just thought it was interesting. You say that the libraries market to little kids to draw them in, and then it seems like they kick out the older kids, and then they just ask the parents their opinions, and then they never go and ask the older kids how they could be involved. But my real question is, you talk a lot about the digital media, the producing things. What about people using the media to connect with cultures around the world? Is there any of that going on where you could really expand your horizons and talk to kids in Sweden or something like that?
That's a big element of what you think about, right, Lee?
Yeah.
Like that kind of global scape.
Global, yeah. I don't know. I think that we have to ask really big questions, and for me, it's always back to like what is the highest purpose of learning, and so there's two aspects to that, and I think you kind of pointed out about the conversation that's happening right now with teachers and what's happening in education, and it tends to be super negative, right? It kind of redefines what it means to be a teacher currently, and sometimes you, at some point, would want to not admit the fact that you're in the profession of teaching, which I think it's amazingly shameful that we live in a society where we're not fully value the idea of a teacher. South Korea called their teachers nation builders. And I think that we have to even take one step further, that we should be into the business of building a better world. And I think, so we shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that we should be very emphatic about changing the world positively. And I think for me, that is the ultimate purpose of learning. And so we're about to face some really wicked, complex problems like climate change. And to tackle climate change, it is politics, it is social, it's human behaviors, it's science. It's no longer a single thing that just needs to, and I think in order to get there, we need a whole different mindset. We need a completely different mindset. And so I think that's our opportunity to think about that at that level. And to make some evaluation that often I hear that somehow our educational system is broken. It's not broken. If you look at the 20th century, it's actually a really bold move. At some point, somebody said, we're going to educate every child for free, right? When you think about the conversation about healthcare right now, that was like a really bold move, and we went and we did it. I think what's happening now is that we need to reconsider and design a new model, not to say that the old model is somehow broken. So the idea of us having to change the whole narrative behind education into the world of the culture that we live in also needs to change. And that's the only way that I think we can really move forward, is to project a very optimistic view of where learning is heading, and the core reason of why we all learn and encourage our children to learn. But ultimately, we need them to have a very different mindset than where we sit right now.
So then to the question, is that kind of like global communication, or that sense that whatever space, we talk about the classroom or the school without walls. I mean, how critical is that to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's where we can really leverage technology and social media, right, in a way that we're afford this generation a very connected way to the global world. and to have, and not just to make a connection, but to have a real authentic sense of empathy about what's happening in the world. I often hear about, sending kids to different places in the world, and somehow when you come back, you're changed. But those human condition doesn't exist for you to learn a lesson. Mm-hmm. So in order to say that, if we're going to have this global connection to the world, then there needs to be a very different mindset and a very different way in which we empathize mm-hmm. with that condition that we're fortunate to sit right here in this world.
I think we had some hands up back there. Okay, here, great.
I love how your comments have transcended your respective fields, that you're not talking about computer science, you're not talking about architecture, you're talking about learning. I think that schools know they need to change. The Friedman article in New York Times triggers a lot of that, Google's doing all this and we don't teach any of that. And I'm sure that you both see a lot of your big ideas quickly reduced to sound bites that are not really what you intended to talk about. How do we get schools to not be reactive and say, well, bulldoze down these walls, or just hand every kid an iPad and use these tools? How do we keep schools elevated to what we all really know is the purpose to begin with, but at the same time adapt and change with how we all know we need to?
I think one of the challenges is that I think we're placing too much responsibility on schools, and really it's a conversation about a community. And in the past, because of like I was a campfire girl and I did all kinds of things as a campfire girl, but there really might not have been the opportunity for my teachers to know what I did, because you didn't have necessarily the bridges, if you will, from all these different spaces where you learn. So we focused on learning only taking place in the school. But nowadays, you really have the ability, and we're doing a lot of work with digital badges and the Chicago City of Learning. You have a way of knowing what kids are doing in other places, and that you can bring it back in and almost have a portfolio, if you will, of the learning opportunities. So I think if we begin to think about learning as taking place everywhere, and even info, like the parks with RFID, you can learn about, any place can be a learning space, and not put all the pressure on classroom teachers, and talk about how we collectively as a community going to take on the responsibility. I've been in schools that don't have gyms, right? Well, but they're right next to a park, but the kid is in a dance program. Can't dancing count as, if that kid is a competitive dancer, can't that count? So I just think, in some sense, if we open it up and think about the technologies are providing ways of knowing what's taking place, and we can say, here's what it means to be a well-educated citizen, and how are you using all the resources available to you in your community, and how are we as a community coming together to make available to you all these resources? And what are schools really good at? And what, is your neighborhood community center, your church, your home, all different places, or this online set of resources? I think we can have a much a broader picture of learning, and actually we can have the real picture of learning, because kids are learning in all these spaces already. We just don't know about them because we don't have the vehicle for bringing those opportunities back in.
Okay, hi.
Hi, I have the pleasure, really, in this part of my career, that I collaborate with educators all over the world to run design learning challenges. And we take on wicked problems. This year's theme is looking into the year 2050 and what jobs might look like. And just in February, I was in the UK, where we ran 3 days of challenges. One day was focused just on UK primary students, which was tons of fun to work with 500 of them. And then the next day, we had more primary students, but we started Skyping with classrooms back in the States who have been running the challenge, classes in Spain, classes in China. So that was over the next couple of days. And just this last weekend, I was in Kansas City during their design week and ran kind of the culmination of that effort, where we took an inner city school in Kansas City and a more affluent school district out in Kansas. And in all of these cases, we've got kids from different places collaborating with each other. and solving the problem. So they're not just teams of people within their context, but they're crossing borders, so to speak. And it's an exciting adventure. Plans for next year, I think, are going to be focused on repurposing towns or villages or neighborhoods that have somehow been lost by industry departing and leaving horrible messes. So lots of things coming.
What question do you have emerging out of that?
Well, it was building on a comment that I think was made earlier about how might we collaborate internationally. And this is just a model that seems to be working well. Design Learning Network, and if you just look up designlearning.us, you'll find it.
Okay.
Talking about spaces and learning, and I was wondering, what about information itself, or curriculum, as we've called it in our schools and universities, or courses? Do you have a different view of, let's say, the space of information, how information is organized and put into some kind of order, let's say? My guess is it might have something to do with your emphasis on making, which is never only history or only reading or only math or only science. But I'm wondering if you've thought about how curriculum is related to learning and space.
Lee?
Curriculum. Well, I have my own bias. I think that I'm living through three of my kids approaching the middle school years, right? So it's kind of like that momentous stage in their kind of learning development. And one of the things that really frustrates me is my oldest son. Maybe I shouldn't talk about this because this is live. You might be watching it. Change subject. In terms of curriculum, my bias has always been that I think 21st century learning, my personal bias is design thinking, is the way to solve really complex problems as a team, that you come together with very different perspectives. And there's been a lot of conversation happening in the world of learning, especially at the higher ed, about the Stanford D School, originated by Kelly, who founded IDEO. But it's intriguing that you have these graduate students that come to this one place because they're able to solve these game-changing, daunting challenges like in time. They're not getting college credit. They're not getting anything more than just their ability to participate in this global context. And they really deploy the idea of how do we come together and using all of our skills, but use a very rigorous process in design thinking to kind of guide our way through some of these challenges that we're facing. And I think that we can all learn from that in the way that we think about K-12 curriculum, pedagogy, and how do we impart. We talk a lot about critical thinking, and we talk about why we ponder why do kids ask the questions, why do we need to know algebra and calculus and physics? Well, here's the reason why you need to know that stuff. It's not just for the sake of knowing how to solve an equations. You can deploy that knowledge to this particular problem that you're solving with your team. Creativity, we just had this conversation about the arts and creativity. Why are we in the conversation of having to bring arts back into the world of learning, right? And fundamentally, I always think that our access to express beauty is a human right. It's not something to be cut out or to be put back in. But on top of that, our ability to think creatively is the essential thing right now as we move forward. So something seems to be like spot on in terms of what we know, and yet we fail to do anything about it. Right? So it's just kind of a frustrating moment, but I'm not sure if I answer your question. I'm just trying to get away from not embarrassing my son. But
Let's try and bring another question. I think we're going to go to the man in the blue shirt, and then we'll go to you. So,
For
man
the
in
teacher,
blue shirt.
Thank you. For the teacher who's ready to just go change things tomorrow, and or just continue to build on the already creative classroom that's happening, what are some concrete examples of ways that you could physically redesign the space from Third Teacher Plus, or those activity structures that you were talking about that create strong student emotion while encouraging productivity at the same time?
yeah, get rid of the teacher's desk. Right, it's for one thing, it says that that's my space, don't come into my space. I would say that think of yourself as part of a team, because I think that you start to interact differently, and when you interact differently, you will conceive that space differently, even though the physical structure might not change. And I think that always look from the lens of the learner. Like, try to look at from the lens of the learner. And I think if you do that, you will profoundly change the way that your space works right now.
And I would say to have performance spaces, opportunities, be clear what the showcases are, what the constraints are for being able to have your work shown. Figure out how to let, if it's something you're doing with seniors or juniors or age, how do you allow spectators from other grades to see what's taking place so that they know what they're aspiring to be, so you know what you're going to, oh, if I get older, I'm going to be able to create this. Make the process of critique visible and peer in a way, but have standards such that everything doesn't make it into the showcase. Because if everything makes it, then why am I going to iterate? So, but be clear about what they are, have check-in and milestones along the way, and try to make sure that you also have an audience outside of just the normal audience that the students will have. But I think one of the bigger things is making sure that they have an audience that the same way their audience can be younger, at the same time that they're showing what they can do, the younger students are learning what's possible. And so you end up with a cycle that just, keeps the learning opportunities going.
I'm always curious if in the academic training of a teacher, is there a course that tells you to fill up every square inch of your walls with something? Because it doesn't have to be that way. And it does say that this is my space, the way that you decorate your space, and maybe try to say this is our space, right? So just really simple things that you can do tomorrow that would, that visual of it has a very impactful way in which it just sends a very different message.
I've always been very interested in developing the academic and the cultural identities of our students and a sense of community. And you have both mentioned that in your comments by using space in a different way. Now that has implications for data that we want to, in which we judge the success of what we want to do and the goals that we have. We always speak finishing high school, be prepared for college, or for the work world. So how do we use data different based on the recommendations that you're giving?
Wow, that's a very good question. So we are using data a little different. We're doing it in ways of making recommendations about where, we don't assume every kid is going down the same pathway, and that the next program, that every kid should go to the same program. Some kids, depending on how they learn a particular subject matter, we might make a suggestion that they do things online, versus other kids, we might suggest that you do something face-to-face. Grouping differently, how do we figure out structures of grouping? But a lot of it, we spend a lot of time on visualization. I mean, we take in all the data from our social network, and we can actually tell you, are you getting feedback from peers, classmates, teachers, how quickly, are you responding in enough time that allows kids to iterate? And how do we visualize that in ways that teachers can say, we can say, here's the top, you should respond to these 4, these are the first things you should respond to. So a lot of it has to do with understanding your, and I don't think this is stuff that anyone can just do, but there is a lot of work going on now in learning analytics and some of the visualizations, but from the standpoint of teachers now, where it used to be from the standpoint of administrators. How can I tell you what % is passing, red light, green light, yellow light? But how do we now begin to come up with more of these visualizations that are more useful for teachers and might not ever see the lens of administrators? You probably haven't seen that stuff yet, haven't made it out, but it is, there is a lot of work happening, but the reality at the same time that that's happening, we're having all the conversations about NSA and let's not share data and, let's not know about what kids are doing. And what I say when we have those conversations is, you want me to be able to recommend to a kid, hey, you did this robotics thing, so why don't you go to this particular workshop over here, and here's some other kids in your school that you might want to work with. But we can't make any of those recommendations if all data goes to the point where it gets closed out and the only thing you can see is in the aggregate. So there's a lot of stuff that's on the horizon that's also potentially about to get shut down based on where some of the discussions are going about access to data and who can access it and who can see it.
Well, I hate to cut things off, but we are going to head out into the lobby and have a reception, and I'm sure there are many more questions, and you'll have the opportunity to speak with Nichole and Lee there. I just want to remind you also that we will be meeting again. We're already planning next year's educational forums, and they will be taking place around the same bat time, this time of the year, and in the same bat place in this space. So please keep an eye out for those and join us in 2015. And I want to thank Trung Lee and Nichole Pinkard and all of you for tonight's event.